Before we begin, spoiler topics have been separated for your convenience. The Legend of Zelda: Tears of the Kingdom. Or is it Tears of the Kingdom? Well, officially it's Tears, but I imagine there's a bit of layered meaning here. Things are falling from the sky like teardrops, but the land itself is also being torn up and changed. And as a sequel that explicitly recycles the game world from Breath of the Wild, Nintendo gave itself a bit of a challenge by trying to make enough of the world different and unidentifiable. And while I think for the most part they do pull it off, I have run into a couple of instances now that are close to a straight rehash. Just for the sake of context though, I'm making this review video without having actually finished the whole game yet, though I have tried to tick every critical box at least once. That includes doing at least one of the dungeons, and poking at the final boss a little too early for comfort. If you've read enough interviews across the history of Zelda, you can actually see an interesting pattern where each mainline game has been an attempt at refining and addressing a major shortcoming in the previous game, while also introducing new ideas. To give an abridged summary, Twilight Princess had a very empty overworld, and most of the developers themselves worked on dungeons. Since dungeons seemed to be so popular, the response was to make the next game's overworld more like a series of above-ground dungeons. In Skyward Sword, it turns out a lot of people were wondering where the real overworld went, so they tried the opposite. Split up the dungeons into 100 small pieces and scatter them across a huge world, making sure that the overworld itself was never too empty, which also solved the Twilight Princess problem. Tears of the Kingdom to me seems to be a response to what Breath of the Wild did, where they spread it possibly too much. Instead of being completely linear like Skyward Sword or completely open like Breath of the Wild, they've dialed things back and added linear sequences to the open nature of the world. It's still fairly open though, and so far I've mostly seen these new worlds be more on the psychological side of things. Stuff like making it even more difficult to cross an area than before, or removing visual points of interest to influence you more towards a certain destination. So the question is, does this work? Well, if they didn't reuse the overworld, I probably wouldn't be constantly making comparisons. For the most part, they've shuffled things around enough to make things interesting, yet still recognizable, like the towns and stuff like that. But there is the occasional place where there's an obvious blank spot, since, well, there used to be something there in Breath of the Wild, and I remember it being there. They managed to cover most of it up though, and while I don't want to specify how much there is, they've also expanded things greatly in the vertical direction. The trailers and promotional material focuses heavily on islands in the sky, but there are also new tunnels and caverns to explore. If you're pedantic about numbers, I could throw out a random number estimate by saying that the world is 3 times larger, but it's a bit more nuanced than that, And I'm still spending about 70 to 80% of my time on land, but that just might be the way I've been playing and what's been catching my interest. At the very least, they've increased the density of encounters and points of interest practically everywhere across Hyrule. In fact, it sometimes feels a bit too crowded and artificial now for my taste. Anyway, almost every system has been tweaked in little ways for better or worse. There's now a drop button in your item belt, for instance, and a new food belt. Although there's no eat button, which was a bit weird to me. And there is an issue where the list gets really big in the mid-game. There's a recipe history now, and the Pro HUD now hides your hearts, although this occasionally feels like a bit of a disadvantage during combat. I've also found auto-saving to be a bit too aggressive, though I'm not entirely sure how different this is in Breath of the Wild. It saves immediately after you land, after a really big jump in the air, and this also happens even if you're in front of an enemy or in the middle of battle. And it doesn't really help that some enemy groups actually spawn entirely when you reload your game. Overall, I'd say Tears of the Kingdom was a really big risk for Nintendo to take, and they mostly pulled it off. The risk comes a lot from how a handful of other open-world games have had this similar situation where the developers just ended up making too much DLC or had too many ideas, and they decided to swing it into a standalone game. But these sequels, well, they were always kind of haunted I would say, by being constantly compared to its predecessor, but it does kind of get better over time. It happened a lot during the beginning of my playthrough, but at this point, I've kind of gotten used to it. There are definitely a number of points where I need to actively break away from a number of preconceptions that I might have had because of Breath of the Wild. There's been probably a dozen or so moments where I tried to do something, but it turns out the system was updated a little bit. If I were to summarize this, Tears of the Kingdom can essentially be described as a full-scale version of the Master Mode DLC, which is probably where this entire game started. But on the other hand, that also includes stuff like higher damage, stronger enemies, and, well, you know, everything shuffled around, like in the Master Quest from Ocarina of Time. That's the foundation of it all, but there's quite a fair bit on top of that as well, and they've definitely done a lot of effort around the game world to make it feel more than just a glorified sequel that's been painted over. In Breath of the Wild, the tutorial zone pushed things to the limit by only forcing you to learn and perform 6 critical actions: towers, the 4 special abilities, and landing with the paraglider. The whole purpose was for Nintendo to re-examine what a player actually needed to play a game without any bloat, and I expected the same here. This time around, you're also forced to buy extra health during the tutorial and use fast travel to teleport somewhere. The health was a bit annoying, but I saw fast travel as a red flag about possible issues in the open world design. It's a really common mechanic, but I'm not fond of using it too much. The new abilities though? All of them feel like improvements on the 4 rooms, and I'm constantly using them, not just outside of shrines, but actively and constantly during combat. It's really the most impressive thing I've seen so far. Well, maybe the second most. Instead of Magnesis, you have the Ultra Hand. Instead of being limited to metal objects in primitive shapes like cubes and spheres, you can pick up anything now, and the shapes are way more complex. Overall, it really makes the manipulation of the physics system more universal, instead of restricting you to small, controlled set pieces. I'm also honestly amazed at the complexity of the physics hitboxes. I've never seen anything quite like it, and there's actually a set of puzzles dedicated solely to objects closely slotting into each other, like a game of Jenga, which feels just revolutionary. As for the next rune, instead of stasis, you have rewind. Stasis was, quite frankly, a bit of a blunt stick, and I always forgot about it. Rewind solves this problem by essentially flipping the perspective. Instead of trying to precisely knock an object in a certain direction, you look at where an object just came from, and you send it back. It really makes things feel more controlled and reliable, while still using the havoc of physics. In other cases, if you only needed to knock something away and didn't care where it went, Ultra Hand has it covered. The replacement for Cryonis, if you think about it, is Ascend. In the tutorial shrine for Cryonis, the only purpose of it was to raise a block out of the ground, which you end up just climbing. The fact that it was also an unmovable, indestructible wall kinda felt tacked on, and it was only available in really specific places. This, again, is sort of replaced by Ultra Hand with the addition of more physics objects lying up, and it's a much more obvious role. Finally, instead of bombs, you have fuse. This is a bit of a weird one because you actually have 2 fuse buttons, one for melee and one for arrows. And what was the most useful thing to stick on arrows across all the Zelda games? Bombs. Bombs were probably the only rune I used outside of shrines, and it didn't even do much damage. It was only ever for crowd control and breaking rocks. In fact, as time goes on, I'm actually rarely using the fuse button and attaching stuff to arrows instead with the secondary button, since it greatly expands my crowd control abilities. And to be honest, you're gonna really need those force multipliers, because everything hits like a truck in this game. There's this hidden mechanic where if your health is full, a deadly hit, no matter how much damage it inflicts, only brings you to a quarter heart. And overall, this has been happening to me way more often than I'm comfortable with. I honestly don't know if this is a case of my exploring a high level area by accident or the game genuinely just being harder. Maybe it's a combination of both, but the game is quite open-ended. In general, it really feels like I'm not supposed to explore straight after the end of the tutorial. I recommend following the main quest for just a little bit first instead of running loose, because there are some things that are a bit tutorial-esque afterwards. And if you have context from Breath of the Wild, you'll figure out really quick why I'm saying this. You don't actually get towers in the paraglider straight away. Breath of the Wild has this really clear cutoff line where they give you all the necessities before you can jump off the Great Plateau, but this game, it just spreads things out a little bit. I suspect it's easier to make things harder for yourself by mistake if this is your first Zelda, or if you skipped Breath of the Wild and you don't have that context. Overall, because of those issues, I'd say Tears of the Kingdom takes maybe around 2 or 3 times as long to really get started and for you to see just new in this game. If you've played Breath of the Wild, then you can metagame your way around, to a certain extent. You can still earn rupees pretty easily, for instance, but it seems like the developers deliberately prevent you from relying too hard on prior knowledge. A lot of farms are just gone, though some are still there. The towns and stables are almost all in the same places, and they've changed in ways that you don't expect. In fact, you'll sometimes run into NPCs that tell you that something moved if you try to go to an old place. The old shrines and towers, however, are simply never acknowledged by the story and characters, and to be honest, this was probably the best option for Nintendo, all things considered. I did try going back to the Great Plateau shrines early on and ended up getting rewarded for it, but it seemed like a one-off. If I understand their development style correctly, Zelda's story has always seemed to get the same treatment as the game mechanics. They look at the previous game, and look at what worked and develop it further, and they identify what's not really workable, and simply not acknowledge it or be vague. It's a lot more obvious this time, since this is a direct sequel with a recycled overworld, but they've gotten away with it every single time before, much to the chagrin of every Zelda timeline theorist out there. But regardless of the overall lore, this series has always been strongest when it focuses on the individual characters, and Tears of the Kingdom does this splendidly. It seems like virtually every NPC in the game has their own little story to tell, and many of them have side quests attached. In fact, sometimes it feels like there are too many side quests. I've been caught a few times wishing I could just access something, when it turns out I need to do a quest first. This ties a bit into my metagame comment earlier, but it's actually a little annoying how often this is done. But annoying as it is, I don't think I can stay that way for long, because some of these vignettes are just great. There really seems to be an overall theme of rebuilding, whether it's the kingdom itself or a personal struggle in life. Sometimes it's a town trying to determine their future, and sometimes it's just a boy trying to prepare a friendship. Maybe I'm being a bit too sentimental here, but sometimes I find myself wishing that some of these short moments you see would last just a little bit longer, but then it passes. On to a different kind of excitement though. Temples are back. It's worth pointing out that dungeons never actually left. It's more accurate to say that they became unidentifiable in Breath of the Wild, but you know, that drew complaints and the obsession for dungeons became a thing. So dungeons are much more obvious this time, taking the open structure of the Divine Beast Temple, generally just making it larger and more maze-like. Without the unifying format of the Divine Beasts, it also makes things more unpredictable, though I'm fairly certain that your experience will vary a great deal. The puzzles are also still predominantly physics and ability based, unlike in the shrines, because remember, shrines are miniature temples in concept. It's why they're called shrines in the first place. The difference is that it's a larger set piece that's less abstract. Thinking of larger set pieces though, let's talk a bit about the sky and underworlds. So far, I've been treating them as places to visit, rather than explore for an extended period. The game so far has been giving me mixed signals about this, because the characters don't really talk about it that much. Both places are largely treated as mysteries, so I don't really know when to explore these places relative to my game's progress. The sky is a bit easier to figure out, since getting up there is tied to the towers. The depths, however, feel much more optional, and I'm largely just driven by curiosity. There's also no easy way to get back to the surface. For the sky, you literally just jump. But for the depths, well, unless I'm still missing something after 40 odd hours, there's occasionally a rare place to use the Ascend skill, but otherwise, you have to teleport and use fast travel. Most people are probably okay with this, since it's just a standard element of open world games, but I feel like this game didn't put enough effort into justifying it, or at least provide more natural options, particularly under the starting zone that you're expected to enter. This has probably been my biggest ongoing peeve with the game so far, and it makes it feel a bit disconnected. On to the final subject. Let's talk about bosses and the final boss. But wait, you might ask, didn't you say you're still playing? Well, much like Breath of the Wild, if you're brave enough, you can go and try to enter the final area straight away. There's an emphasis on the word try though, since it's much more difficult to do this time around. It was very possible for you to accomplish this in Breath of the Wild, and one of my most memorable moments was, quite honestly, successfully sneaking in past everything and defeating Ganon early. And if you do that, you actually have to fight all the game's bosses in a boss rush first. In Tears of the Kingdom though, the developers have deliberately made the final bosses way more difficult if you don't defeat them in the right places. After trying this and then fighting the bosses in their rightful place, my reaction was quite literally, Nintendo, you son of a gun, that didn't hurt. To be a bit less masochistic though, much like the temples, the bosses feel more like natural parts of the world instead of something otherworldly and artificial like the Divine Beasts and Blight Ganon. As for how challenging they are, I don't really have a good reference point for that, but I think that's going to happen to a lot of people since it's an open world. There isn't really a good check if you have excessive health or weapons when you fight a boss, and maybe it's more interesting that way. At the time of writing this, I think I'm actually going to put the game down for a little while. Not because I don't like it per se, but because I've been playing this for 2 straight weeks, and the end's not in sight. I'm gonna suffer from burnout soon if I don't take a week off, and that's a genuine risk when the game is just too big and you want to take your time. Also, my future self was probably editing this video for a bit long. There is a lot to discover here, and you will get your money's worth. If you just want to do the main story, then you probably don't need to worry about taking a month or 2. But the number of side stories and epilogues to each chapter really feels endless so far. And best of all, it's still mostly open-ended. What I found beautiful about Breath of the Wild was that it was very carefully engineered so that every player's adventure was different, despite not being a procedurally generated world. I think Tears of the Kingdom is mostly the same, though I have a hunch I'm being punished or lightly nagged for ignoring the main story a bit too long. It makes me wonder about the attrition rate for Breath of the Wild, but that's a little hard to know. In any case, that's probably most of the critical points I want to bring up, and I hope it was informative. If you made it to the end, let me know what you think in the comments if you like this format. Until next time.